My name's Stuart, pronouns they, them. I live in London. I have CML, which is a chronic form of myeloid leukemia. It's incurable and it's managed with kind of microdosing of pills that are chemo that you take, and you take it for the rest of your life. Prior to doing what I do now, I was a tattooer, evidently. And I moved to Germany to actually pursue this and expand my career and get out of London. And it was actually in Germany about 6 months in that I found out through having food poisoning that I had leukemia. When you take yourself into chronic health, it becomes part of who you are and it becomes intersectional with your identity. And those things pull in quite closely, and they end up sort of defining who you are. So that's the kind of support you go and seek. And whenever I went to find support, a lot of it was very heteronormative. A lot of the booklets, if not nearly all the booklets, didn't really show any kind of queer visibility. Even booklets like Men and Sexuality or whatever, it was just about heteronormative assumptions of how to safely have sex with cancer. And I wanted to talk about the fact that I'd been told that I wouldn't be able to have kids and what that meant as a queer person and the different things you're already thinking about with that. I wanted to talk about my identity. I wanted to relate to other people in my community, not necessarily with the cancer type, because I know that was super rare, but just be surrounded by people that I felt reflected who I was. There's been a pronounced lack of LGBT-specific support, especially oncology and cancer care, and it's something that I was aware of through being a patient, but now that I actually have a working relationship with a number of hospitals, but primarily King's College Hospital in London, we've identified that there needs to be more specific attention brought to and also support for this community. And you're slowly starting to see this be reflected in government discussions, the reports they're releasing about the fact that we need better ways to actually quantify sexualities and gender so we can identify where that support's needed and actually hand it out. But that's a long process and it takes a while, and there's always funding and red tape. So through my work and being independent, I'm able to bridge that gap much faster, work with the hospitals, have them signpost to me so that we can support people as quickly as possible. And through that working relationship, we can also feed that information back and try and inform policy. And that's where the advocacy part of the service comes in, where we take what we've learned and what we have discussed and go to the people in charge, go to the people who are providing the service, go to the people who may not necessarily think that we need specific treatment, and explain to them why it's unique. Yes, everybody needs a certain level of cancer care, but you can't treat everybody the same. You have to understand each individual community's risk factors, the things that make them who they are, and help accommodate them, especially when they're going through such a serious part of their life that will shape them forever, even if they make it into survivorship. You know, it's important to make sure that you provided the best possible care.
When I was diagnosed, it took some time because I was quite ill, but the doctor didn't know what was wrong with me. And my dad was taking me to the doctor pretty much every week. And it got to a point where, as we were like leaving the doctors, he would just go to the desk and make an appointment for the next week because he knew we'd be back. And eventually I got some tests done and they found out I had leukemia. I was very much socialized as an ill child. I wasn't really specifically socialized in as strict a gender role as a lot of children would be. And I think part of that is when you are a child, when you're pre-puberty, there are sort of physical similarities that are more obvious than after puberty. And one of the only ways that people really differentiate little boys and little girls is their hair. And none of us had any hair. We were all wearing hospital gowns a lot of the time, or pajamas. So in terms of just visually, people, it was very normal for children to be like, oh, are you a boy or a girl? Because we couldn't tell each other apart in that way, which I think is probably quite unusual for most children. I'm part of the trans community. I am a non-binary trans man. So for me, that means that very much socially, I exist in the world as a man. My pronouns are he, him. I use words like Mr. or, if I'm lucky, sir, to describe myself. But some of my gendered experiences fall slightly outside of a very strict gender binary. I think if I hadn't had cancer, I probably would have known I was trans much earlier, because I think part of it is I was so busy thinking about very immediate problems that I did not have time to have a gender crisis, because I was thinking about, I feel really unwell a lot of the time, and then, oh, I'm very behind on school and it's hard to make friends and so forth. Because I'm someone also who's neurodivergent, I think a lot of things that might have been picked up as autistic kid traits or queer kid traits were all attributed to like traumatized cancer child.
So in your experience, being someone that's survived and now living with it after, what kind of support have you been looking for? Do you still look for it? And what was your previous experience?
I don't think I really actively looked for support in like a peer support group, because
Mm.
I think I was never exposed to the idea of it really. And so I was like, well, there's not going to be a thing for me. I didn't know about your group. If I come across something like it, I probably, like, especially as a young teenager, I think would have been so useful for me.
There's a lack of holistic support where you can kind of come and just be yourself,
Yeah.
in every aspect of that, whether it's neurodivergent, a cancer patient, trans, all these aspects. So you don't have to say, going into a space, today I'm just going to be this person.
Exactly. I think that's been a massive problem for me, especially like in my the most recent therapy I've had, which was actually very useful in some things. I had to basically just leave massive parts of who I was and what I found difficult at the door, because they were like, well, no, we treat this thing through this lens for these people. If you're not these people, you can't have this treatment. And so I'm like, well, I need this treatment, so I'm going to have to be this person you need me to be to some extent.
I think that's what the healthcare system doesn't appreciate is you're never just one thing. And I know it's like, a bit utopic to think that we can get everything from something, but it's why the work I do is actually outside of the hospital. So although I work with them, but when you are in that system, it's a lot about who's funding you, who can access the service. In London, especially with cancer services, you have to get the additional support from your local hospital. So if there's another hospital in like a different borough and they're running a service or a support group you really want to go to, quite often you can't because it's not under their kind of funding. So that's why I think I'm really into the idea of queering the system. It doesn't have
Yeah.
to just be running on their models, and that's why it's nice providing a service where anyone can come and what they bring is their uniqueness, and that's
Hmm.
what changes the conversation. It's what gives us something else to think about. Your experience is incredibly unique, and at the same time there's things that I relate to in that, like the leukemia aspect or growing up with gender dysphoria and where that kind of fits in, and like how you also deal with things like queer identity and fertility and moving forwards. And I think it's very easy for a healthcare professional to wrap all these questions up with, but you survived, you're good. So, as the person that facilitates the group, it's always straddling between benefiting from the group on a personal level, but also making sure the group runs smoothly. So, I'm always very keen to make sure that everyone's heard. We get a larger mix of genders as well as sexualities and ages, and that's actually a strength of the group. So, there's a lot of cross pollination of ideas of how to cope with their health. There's also a lot of experiences that people can kind of understand and converge on, whether it be physical health issues like early menopause, or it can be other issues like systemic issues with family. So, it actually is a really great way to have a mix of people, and then getting people of all those different walks of life to come together shows that there is that community out there for you, and that's the bit that I definitely was looking for. And it's been really great to see it actually come together and see people benefiting from that mutual care.